get started, so
Yes.
won't take about a minute.
So
You're live, go ahead.
Cue when you're ready. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, I'm Greg Nelson with Ralph Anderson and Associates. We're the search firm selected by the city of Salem to help recruit and select its next chief of police. We worked with the city to design an inclusive search process that included heavy community and stakeholder input at the beginning of the search, including an online survey. And now as we approach the final steps of the process, the community has an opportunity to meet the two finalists. We'll have about 30 minutes with each candidate today, and I'll guide the candidates through our discussion. After introducing themselves to you, each candidate will take about 10 minutes of their time to explain how they would plan to transition into the role of Chief of Police for the City of Salem. Following that would be a number of questions that were submitted by the community, along with the candidates' closing remarks. Our first candidate today will be Mr. Malik Aziz, followed by Mr. Trevor Womack. Welcome, Malik.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. It's good to see you again. And you can go ahead and take your mask off if you feel comfortable just for this portion here. And we're looking forward to this opportunity for the Salem community to hear about your qualifications and interest in the Chief of Police position. We have 30 minutes for our discussion. We'll begin with an introduction from you, followed by an opportunity to hear about how you approach your first 6 months as the new Chief of Police for the City of Salem. And following that, we'll have some questions submitted by the members of the Salem community. At the end, we'll leave you the opportunity to make a closing comment about your interest in becoming the next Chief of Police for the City of Salem. So to get started, would you just please share with the Salem community your background and experience and how it's prepared you for this position? And Jessica from Ward 2 had a question. She'd like to know, what is it about the Salem community that made you want to live and work here? So if you include both of those.
All right. Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed a tour of the city and the new police headquarters, and it's both have been fantastic. My background is I started in policing almost 30 years ago. Right before that, I was with the Dallas Sheriff's Office, and I joined the Dallas Police Department in 1992. I went up the ranks, worked in various locations, from senior corporal to trainer, sergeant, lieutenant, to deputy chief. And so I enjoyed being in a lot of places, doing a lot of things from specialized, being over specialized operations, being involved with specialized crime units, and having some of the biggest events in the city. I've commanded the largest of the parades. I was a first three-time commander of the State Fair, Texas, which has 3.5 million people over 24 days with about 250,000 people on some heights or some days. I was in charge of the Bush Library dedication opening, which was the largest security event in the city of Dallas, and I've had since 2013 or so. I've been over many numerous protests in the city of Dallas during a certain time frame, up until a few years ago. And with another hat on, I teach at a university, DeSales University, as adjunct professor. I'm over the Dallas Police Museum Board as the chairman, and entrusted with building or standing up a police museum dedicated to the history. And along the way, I was a local and regional and national chair executive director of a police association. So with different hats on, internal and external, I've been in the room with innovation and creativity to what I consider to be one of the best police departments in the nation, as many others have considered, with some of the best chiefs in the nation, and parts of my tenure that I've been blessed to be a part of in that room. I think what led me to Salem is reading about it. This is my first time being in Oregon. But it stood out as a really a beautiful place with a lot of parks, a lot of places, destinations you could get to, a big city without all of the hassles of a big city, and just a great place if you have children to go to school. It had several top schools in the top 50, vibrant college places within a 70-mile radius, and a lot of things that was being offered here in Salem is just a good, family living, a good place to settle in and work and become part of the fabric of a growing and progressive community.
Thank you for that. Could you now please take up to 10 minutes to discuss how you approach your first 6 months as the new chief of police for the city of Salem? And along with that, Thomas from Ward 2 had a related question. So if you could include in your response what actions you would begin to establish relationships and build trust with folks in our city who live in less affluent neighborhoods or are members of underrepresented groups, including communities of color.
Yes, the philosophy of dealing with communities of color and where I would come from. I'll address that first before I start talking about my 6 months. It is really to do these things right here, and that is when I look at procedural justice and fair and impartial policing, that everyone should enjoin in having that as a right, not as a privilege. And what I say is I give them 4 things, and that is treat all people with dignity and respect. Give everyone a voice in the process, and that's in the communities in which we live, work, and play or entertained in. And 3, that we should always be concerned with relevant facts of any situation and not irrelevant things associated with it. And lastly, we give people the understanding and that we have their best interests at heart. So trying to get into communities, diverse communities of color, then my approach is to lay that as a foundation, not just externally, but internally. Visibility is the #1 key to going inside of communities and being from a community like that. I came inside of communities that were very diverse. I came inside of communities that were segregated. I have something to offer from being from that background to know what works, what doesn't work, and the best things I can say that we address first is get involved with non-governmental organizations, be involved with youth and all kinds. Back in 2007, me and another sergeant, who was a sergeant at the time, still a sergeant, we restarted under David Kunkel the Police Athletic Activities League. And we put things in motion that became one of the first, it was the first program to do a STEM event with the Dallas Independent School District, which numbers of 150,000 plus students. And so things like that. Later, it evolved into much better things than what we implemented. We had boxers who went to Junior Olympics and Olympics now. But later, under other people, it evolved into one of the greatest organizations that I've ever seen. But it started, with us, and that was teaching people how to play the piano or debate or taking them hiking. So we got to get involved with the youth. The next thing on that, when we start dealing with communities of color, is make sure we get involved in all aspects of rehab and reentry, that we play a role in that. We play a role in bringing people back to the community in a safe and responsible way. We play a role in making sure that we don't start criminalizing addiction when it's problematic, and we start giving people, instead of long sentences to get worse, we give them things to make them get better and overcome addiction. Because I come from a family that some of my brothers and sisters were addicted, so I take a great interest in that. And lastly on that is to deal with our aging population, our seniors, to make sure that they aren't victims of scams in all communities, that we show that we care. The other side is if we have a vibrant Latinx or Hispanic population, that we make sure that we have people who can speak Spanish, who can talk the language and understand the culture, that we make sure that we have people who can go to different organizations that have a very diverse group or even a special interest group, that we have people who have a uniform on with a badge and authority, that they don't see us in that way, that we're able to talk to them. So those are just a few things that I want to get involved in for breaking down the barriers. And the same things that I saw work in my lifetime, starting out in West Dallas projects, and then, elevating to a very vibrant neighborhood that was middle class. And so those things worked in my family, in my life. I think the, universal culture around this United States, we're not so different. We're one and the same across a lot of avenues. Now, along the lines, on my first 6 months into the police department here, there's a lot of things that take place first. Coming from where I'm from, then I would see that we're going to start out with some of the issues that we already have, and I'll get to the meetings later, but we need to look again. The community and officers have requested body-worn cameras, so we need to find a way to progress that and see if we could find the funding for that. So that's a first day look at to see where we are on that and how we can make it happen. We also need to look at the SROs in conjunction with the school administrators. Do they want the police in the schools? Do they want the police to take a different role in the schools? That has to be first and foremost, even though school hasn't started back up here. That's going to be, just a couple of months into the new year. That'll be right on the agenda for us to do that. We also, are going to have to look at some of our protocols, from use of force, de-escalation, implicit bias, our response to mass demonstrations, from mobile field force to the use of less lethal weaponry, and our response to it. So I want to get started on looking at our processes for those kind of things. And then comes the much harder part, and that is getting around to the community, meeting with the city leaders from different departments, the mayor, city manager, city councilors, getting out into the community and meeting with advocates and activists alike, formulating a community advisory committee to get the people with like minds or not to contribute to the progressive and vibrancy of the police department and the city, bringing those together. I also want to look at, a few years ago we had 21st century policing, which was 58 recommendations that were put forth to make departments better. I want to take a look at where we were, what did we implement, were they successful, or if we implemented any of those at all. They were good a few years ago, they're still good now, and we need to take a look at that. We're already CALEA certified here, and being CALEA certified, then we've already jumped over a lot of obstacles that have occurred here in Salem. But what we haven't done, and that we need to do more of, not that we haven't done it, what we need to do more of is explaining to the community these kinds of things with mass protests and mass riots that sometimes turn deadly. But my goal in Salem is to get on the ground and meet with all those groups, from any civic group, like-mind group or not, or any NAACP or Urban League or any other organization, non-governmental organization that seeks to make Salem a better place.
Great, thank you for that. The next question has to do with mental health and mental illness. And Jason from Ward 6 asked a question. I'll paraphrase the first part of it, but there are a number of conditions which appear to be invisible, that people look normal in ordinary circumstances, but in stressful situations they may escalate to verbal or physical behaviors that appear to be defiance. And across the country, similar situations have on occasion ended in officer-involved violence. What can the department do to ensure positive outcomes in these incidents?
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with people in mental health psychosis or mental health crisis, that we have to understand that we see people on their worst day, not their best day, and making decisions on their worst day sometimes have gotten us into a quagmire or positions of controversy that we can't seem to get out of. And so I say to start that we have to handle all of those instances with care. I think I've been fortunate in Dallas PD, in the last years, all the way up from years before to now, that we've had progressive mind leaders who wanted to pay attention to our response to people who are suffering in a mental health crisis. So I'll say, part of this to ensure that we do the right things. There's a lot of programs that are taking place. Dallas was at the forefront of offering up a program that engaged paramedics, mental health workers, and police answering those type of calls where people are in need of suffering from a crisis. So we were able to deploy, and we get thousands of calls each month on dealing with that. Now, even in a pilot program that was made possible by our philanthropic organizations that gave money to see it, because the business community wanted to see a better day in dealing with people who were suffering from a mental health crisis. And so we've been able to do that, and it's gotten better over the years. Even though it started under previous administrations, we haven't missed a beat going forward up until this day with that. Bringing those type of programs, I understand it's already a type of program here that could be transitioning to not having police there. And I would be in agreement with those kind of programs as long as there was no violence mentioned, because that's a police response for all types of violence. And now we're going to have to train our people in better de-escalation techniques, for better reasonable alternatives, a better way to respond, making sure that we have what is the national standards of 40 hours of training and refresher courses, and stay up on best or promising practices that are involved with treating people in a mental health crisis. The flip side of that is most of the times that we're dealing with people on the streets in the homelessness, arena, and that we have a homelessness population that are here that we need to address. Most studies have shown that somewhere between 80 and 90% suffer from some kind of mental health, psychosis, or even drug addiction. And that's where we're going to have to look at it in a non-traditional way of actually getting inside and treating people for the actual causation, not treating a symptom. And that means that if they have an addiction problem, that we do all we can to get them out of the environment. If they have mental health crises, that we are able to facilitate them with medicine. If they have some PTSD issue that's going on, that we offer and we engage with our other city and state departments, and that we offer what we have inside, because we're all in a team together with Salem to make it better. So I would like to address it from those angles, knowing that we shouldn't. There's no one in that place should be criminalized, and then go with an understanding that the better trained we are less likely to have a negative outcome. Now, that won't say that you won't have a negative outcome, but we want to mitigate those outcomes of negativity as much as we possibly can. And we've done a great job in Dallas with that, of trying to train our officers up and to put in place programs that would show that we're at least progressive and forward thinking, and that's been going on for quite a while. So I think we can implement some of those things here, or we can enhance what has already been in place for what I've been told.
Very good. Natasha from Ward 6 asks, this year the Salem saw protests that resulted in the police using tear gas and other such crowd control measures for the first time in recent history. How would you approach crowd control in large gatherings such as protests, and what standards do you use when determining if a police presence and escalated response is necessary?
Well, I think the first things you're dealing with is, do you have a properly trained police force? Did you give them training, or are they properly trained? That's two different things. And mobile field force and dealing with mass demonstrations, that's so important, about how many hours you get, who is giving the directions, who is giving any orders about what will be used. So who is giving an order to use pepper ball or stingers or rubber bullets or anything that's less lethal, including whether that's CN or CS, tear gas. What are you using? So that has to be given up front. That comes with training. That comes with having a briefing, a real briefing about who will give directions and who will give guidance and what we will do. It also comes with having a plan. There are some things that happen around the nation, even like after George Floyd, and it looks like many police departments were caught flat-footed of not having any training or not being prepared and ready to train, thinking that that was an isolated incident. People who have been in policing for quite a while, we knew that that was not a isolated incident, and that we needed to be prepared to go out and do those things. So the first part is training. The next part is making sure that we have a viable plan and that we keep plans in place. You can't outplan people with their own mind when they want to do something, but we have to have a understanding of what will be our response. And if that is exercising patience, then we need to exercise more patience. If that is exercising the force continuum or going up to using those type of things, then we need to know that. I don't know unless situations were really dire that we will be using things like tear gas unless we absolutely necessarily had to. And I think when you enjoin trust with the community at large, that they would have a police chief or commander, and they would know that their police department, when we have to take action, that it was for the greater good, or a life or serious injury was at stake, and that we would have tools at our disposal that was decided by higher ups. And when you get to things like gas, that is probably most likely a chief of police decision in this day and age. It is no longer down into first line supervisors or second line when it comes to a matter of life and death. Those issues have to be made on the spot. But when they come from planning, then we know who's giving the order, when the order will come, what to expect when it happens. And so I look at things from that point of view. Some departments have done it better than others, and some we could always do it better. And you can't outplan a person's mind when they want to do something against the group's desires, that they may go rogue from a group that is peaceful, and some of the actions you take may affect peaceful people.
Thank you. This next question you've touched on a bit, but Ryan from Ward 5 asks, how do you see the role of police in interacting with Salem's homeless population? And how can we trust you to serve the population beyond the past failed methods of arrests and moving homeless camps?
Yeah.
How can we empower police to work with the homeless population toward long-term solutions?
Yeah, I don't think you'll ever arrest your way out of any problem dealing with homeless people. It just won't work. It hasn't worked all the time, so you can practice a definition of insanity and do the same things over and over expecting a different result. But arresting your way out of any crime problem or any problem like that, it's usually not the answer. It's a short-term, quick solution, but it doesn't work in the long term. I don't ever want to criminalize being homeless. But I talked about some of these things earlier. What we have to do is not think that the police department is the 911 call to correct or alleviate any actions dealing with homeless. We have homelessness or units or sections inside of our city. We address them in neighborhood policing, and we work together with other groups, but we're going to have to get down to the cause. We're going to have to get down to why is a person homeless, and are they suffering from a mental health crisis? Are they suffering? Are they one of the people who just had some unfortunate incident where they lost their job and they find themselves on the street? That's what we have, NGOs for, to get in the middle of that, to get a greater understanding of how we can help people without criminalizing homeless populations. Even today, and I say, Dallas is no different from having large amounts on a greater scale of a homeless population from what I've seen here in Salem today, and what's happening really across the nation with our homelessness population. And so I don't think that we, from my perspective, that our solution is offering help. Taking people to jail and trying to arrest your way out of that problem won't solve our problem. From business owners who need relief, then it's just a symptom. They get tired of calling and saying, come get the person from sleeping in front of my place, and that's a daily occurrence whenever they get back out of a facility. So we haven't resolved anything. We haven't made it to a resolution on anything, and we tie up our police doing those kinds of things when they're needed more, handling a violent situation or person-to-person situation. So I think my partnership is with the city, leaders, with the city sections that are directly engaged with that, and non-governmental organizations who have a part to play. And what I've seen here, and it's very vibrant not too far away from here of offering their expertise, and sometimes they do it better than city entities, and they certainly can do it better than police departments, because our goal is we bring authority with a badge and a gun, and we only know one actual way to get that resolved, when there are so many other ways to alleviate that problem. And across the country, they're having this issue. I think Salem can be a leader in addressing the issues and taking some of the best and promising practices and becoming a place that people look at for better promising practices for our city.
Thank you, Malik, and that takes us to the end of our time today. What would you like to leave the Salem community with in closing?
Well, I would like to, say, well, thank you for having me, in your city. I've had a wonderful time, touring your city and seeing what you have to offer here. It's a great city. I believe that I have, given the majority of my life now to policing with over 3 decades, and I've learned on some of the best and progressive chiefs in the nation. I've been in the room for creativity and innovation. And my record is well documented for crime reduction and community engagement and administration. So I've been well-rounded, not just internally, but I've went to the top externally and other organizations. And I continue to explore other fields from, teaching to leading other non-governmental organizations or not-for-profit, organizations, and giving my time for that. So I think I built a police career that is very diverse and, progressive. And I think that, as Salem is such a wonderful city, I believe that I have something to offer to the police department and the citizens of Salem alike. And that's what, I'll have. And I don't think there's any direction to go wrong with people who are here today, and so I think we've ended up in a very good position either way. And I would just like to thank the people for having me.
And thank you.
Okay.
Welcome, Trevor. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
And we're looking forward to this opportunity for the Salem community to hear about your qualifications and your interest in the chief of police position. We have 30 minutes for our discussion, and we'll begin with an introduction from you, followed by an opportunity to hear from you about how you approach your first 6 months as the new chief of police for the city of Salem. And following that, we'll have some questions submitted by members of the Salem community. At the end, we'll leave you an opportunity to make a closing comment about why you're interested in becoming the next chief of police for the city of Salem.
Okay.
So let me go ahead and get started and just ask you to please share with the Salem community your background and experience and how it's prepared you for this position. And along with that, Jessica from Ward 2 would also like to know what is it about the Salem community that made you want to live and work here?
I'll start with that last part first then. Salem to me is just a beautiful community that's growing. It's vibrant. It's got a beautiful downtown. I love the location also. You're an hour or less to the coast and an hour from the mountains as well, so it's perfectly situated. I think you have a police department that's a little smaller than the one I'm from, but that's what I'm excited about, working in a little bit of a smaller community where I can get to know the officers and the department a little more personally and the community better. And my wife and I, selfishly, my wife Christina and I have talked about moving to Oregon at some point in our lives for many years. And so when this position presented itself, it just looked to both of us like the perfect opportunity at the perfect time. And so that's what drew me to Salem. You mentioned my qualifications for the position, and so I do think that I'm uniquely and fully qualified for this position for many reasons. For me, it starts with my lifetime commitment to public service. My father was a police officer also, and so I knew from the time I was a child what I wanted to do with my life career-wise, and I've spent almost 29 years now doing exactly that. But even outside of that paid public service, I've always believed in giving back to my community through my time and my dollars. So I've always been involved in various volunteer efforts and charitable organizations as well. So I have that lifetime commitment to public service and also community service that I want to bring with me into Salem. And I've got the academic pedigree now to back me up. I started back in 1992 as a police officer with nothing but a high school diploma, like many police officers, I think. And I'm a lifelong learner, so I went back to school while raising a family and working a challenging career, and got my AA, and I got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice. And most recently, I got my master's degree in security studies from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And along the way, I attended many leadership programs as well, like the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia, and the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative in New York City. I completed the California Peace Officer Standards and Training Executive Development course, which prepares you to step into the Chief of Police role. So I've got those academic accomplishments behind me. I'm proud of those. But also, frankly, those don't mean much unless you can take that newly acquired knowledge and apply it in a real-world setting and get results and build a track record of success. And so I think the biggest value I have coming into Salem are my set of experiences and my track record of success. And as a deputy chief now in Stockton, basically the #2 position for the past 8 years, I've handled all manner of high-level incidents, from very complex criminal investigations to very high-profile officer-involved shootings, for example, to the most complex personnel matters you can think of, terminating police officers for misconduct, and arresting our own police officers for criminal behaviors, to major protests. I've managed protests that shut down city streets for hours, that involved vandalism and acts of violence, and even protests that took over City Hall and shut down city council meetings. And we've handled those very professionally. I'm proud of the way we've handled those. And thankfully, luckily, we've never had to deploy gas or less lethal munitions in any of those protests. To bankruptcy, the city of Stockton filed for municipal bankruptcy. So in effect, we defunded the police department over a decade ago. We cut 25% of our sworn staff. The rest of us that remained, we took about 23 to 25% pay cuts ourselves. And so I've led through that sort of crisis and chaos as well. And the more recent work I've done with the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, as far as using evidence-based practices to move the needle in building trust with your community and the police. So I've got all that type of experiences in my policing career. Outside of that, also, I'm culturally comfortable, and I prefer that term instead of culturally competent, because that sounds arrogant to me for some reason. I grew up in Stockton, one of the most diverse cities in the nation, and I went through the public school system there, and I've policed effectively now in that environment for almost 29 years. So I'm comfortable in any cultural setting. And I think in totality, what that's given me on the whole is a refined set of progressive ideas about where we need to move as a profession in law enforcement. But importantly, those ideas are grounded in reality, and they're backed up by a track record of successful implementation. So that's why I'm interested. What drew me to Salem, that's also why I think I'm the most qualified candidate, and I hope some more of that comes out today. So I look forward to taking some questions.
Absolutely. Well, we'll start with asking you to please take about 10 minutes to discuss how you'd approach your first 6 months as the new Chief of Police for the City of Salem. And wrapped in that, Thomas from Ward 2 asked a related question. So if you could include in your response what actions you would begin to establish relationships and build trust with folks in the Salem community who live in the less affluent neighborhoods and or members of underrepresented groups, including communities of color.
Great. Yes, thank you for that question. I recognize my first 6 months, if I'm given this honor to lead this agency, especially as an outsider coming into the community and the organization, those first 6 months are critical. There's a lot of work to do, and they're critical being that they set up the foundation for future success. And so there's going to be a lot of work to do, a little bit of time to do it in, and so I'm going to hit the ground running. And I've actually given this a lot of thought. So I've come up with 5 key objectives that I really want to make sure I try to accomplish during those first 6 months. Number one, I recognize that I'm going to have to earn legitimacy in the eyes of multiple stakeholders. I'm going to be sworn in, put the badge on, given the title Chief of Police, but that doesn't earn me legitimacy or credibility with the community or the men and women that serve in the Salem Police Department. And so I'm going to have to earn that legitimacy. Number two, so I'm going to have to focus on that during the first 6 months. And secondly, I'm also going to have to set very clear expectations for the staff in the organization. I've got some thoughts on that as well. I'm also going to have to assess the organization. Excuse me, my paper's falling here. Assess the organization as quickly as I can to try to call out the strengths and weaknesses. Also, I'm going to have to begin. I want to begin to introduce a new idea or policing philosophy into the organization during these first 6 months as well. And finally, as I reach the end of those 6 months, I want to be well positioned to lead effectively with a new shared vision. So those are the 5 objectives that I'm going after during my first 6 months. And I'll touch on each one of those a little bit more in more detail. But first I want to talk about my approach generally towards accomplishing those. And number one, I'm going to remain highly visible. Again, as an outsider trying to earn legitimacy, I'm going to remain highly visible, highly communicative, and even reassuring. And what I mean by that is there may be some trepidation or some mistrust with a new leader coming in. And so I need to reassure staff and the community of the integrity of my decisions and of my intentions. And so I'm going to be highly communicative, highly visible, and reassuring where needed as well. Secondly, I'm going to want to make sure to set those clear expectations that I mentioned before. But I'm going to do that in a way where I'm remaining pragmatically optimistic all the time, because at heart, I'm an optimist, and I always like to find the good in every situation. And I know for a fact with every threat or every challenge, there's an opportunity, sometimes golden opportunities. And so I'm an optimist, but I also like to get things done in the real world, so I'm a pragmatist too. So I'm going to remain pragmatically optimistic throughout those first 6 months. I'm also going to be action-oriented, because I'm a person that likes to get things done and make progress. And sometimes I have a little bit of problem with my patience for that very reason. I like to get things done. So I'm going to be action-oriented, taking a look at identifying next steps and action items that we need to accomplish, and even more importantly, who's responsible for those and what's the timeline, so we can hold ourselves accountable to making progress. So I'm going to stay action-oriented. And finally, as far as my approach, I'm going to remain always open to listening. I consider myself to be a highly collaborative leader. I like to get a lot of input in the decision-making process. I like to hear from various stakeholders and get different perspectives on any situation. And so I'm going to remain always willing to listen as well. So that's generally how I will approach those 5 objectives that I've set out. But to touch on those again, when I talk about earning legitimacy in the eyes of multiple stakeholders, there are a lot of stakeholders, and it's a daunting task actually. So I've tried to think of what would I focus on in the first 6 months in that short period of time, and I've come up with 4 groupings of stakeholders that I think are critical to really invest time in during those first 6 months. One of those being the department or the city leadership. So, for example, the city councilors, the mayor, my boss, the city manager, the other department directors that I'll be working with on the executive team, just investing some time there, laying the foundation for some trusting relationships with that city leadership team. The second group of stakeholders I've been thinking of is the community, and I'm going to have to invest a lot of time and effort in that. And I've been thinking about just trying to take a cross-section of the community, looking at all sectors across the community, and reaching out to the various leaders of those organizations, investing some time, introducing myself, getting to know them, and again, trying to lay that foundation for a trusting relationship. So those community stakeholders. And then importantly as well, those departmental leadership stakeholders. So within the department itself, I'm going to have to earn the legitimacy up and down the chain of command. So I think I will start with the top echelon, the 3 deputy chiefs that I'll be working closely with as my command team. Make sure we try to align our priorities as quickly as possible, get on the same page, so to speak, and then work my way through the entire organization at all levels, managers, supervisors, line staff, and I'm talking here about the sworn staff and also the non-sworn professional staff as well. So just really investing in those department members as well. And finally, last group of stakeholders, I like to think of this group as our collaborative leadership in the community. Those are the stakeholders in the community that work together on the most complex social issues that we deal with that affect public safety. For me, the best example there would be chronic homelessness, for example. There is no agency to end homelessness. And so by its very nature, it demands very high levels of cross-boundary collaboration. And so I'm going to be scanning for those type of relationships in the community. Some already exist that I already know about. I want to reaffirm those relationships, but I'm going to be scanning for others, those collaborative partners that I want to engage with so that we can be as effective as we can as a law enforcement agency. So that's about earning legitimacy in the eyes of multiple stakeholders. I also said I want to set high expectations and clear expectations. And for me, that's just about from day one. I'm going to continually express my primary values as a leader, my foundational values, which are teamwork, trust, transparency, teamwork, trust, transparency, professionalism, and excellence. Those 5 values, and they kind of serve as a foundational set of expectations as well, because it signals to the organization what they can expect from me as a leader, but it also signals what I expect back from each individual and the organization as a whole. So I'm just going to continually express those values from the beginning to kind of set the expectations. Third, I talked about assessing the organization. So my team and I are going to conduct a good, thorough assessment of the organization, a 360-degree assessment. But there are a few areas that I want to dive into quickly during those first 6 months, and those are our policies and procedures. I want to make sure those are current, contemporary, lawful, and most importantly, are they reflective of the values that we want to project as an organization and that the community expects of us. I want to take a look at our policies through that lens. I also want to take a good, quick look at our recruiting, hiring, training, and promotional opportunities within the organization, the processes there as well. Because I'm a firm believer and I highly value the diversity of an organization. I think a police organization must be as reflective of its community as possible. So I want to take a look at those processes to make sure there's no barriers there, and if there's any areas for improvement. And that's going to be a priority for me throughout my tenure if I'm given this opportunity. Also, just the effectiveness and efficiency of the organization as a whole, and also our technologies. Are we using advanced technologies, and are we using them in the right way also? So those are the 4 areas I want to dive in deeply when we assess the organization during those first 6 months. And I touched on wanting to introduce a new policing philosophy into the organization. And from what I can tell so far about Salem, the folks that I've talked to in the community, the folks that I've talked to within the organization, the surveys that I've seen, that the community surveys that the city produces, Salem has a very good relationship with its community. So there's a strong foundation there that already exists. And so what I want to do is bring in the 2 pillars of a new policing philosophy and set those right on top of that existing foundation within the Salem Police Department. And those pillars are smarter policing and principled policing. Smarter policing is just about being data-driven, using evidence-based approaches, intelligence-led policing, just smart, effective strategies. It's kind of about the what we do and how we do it. Smarter policing. The principled policing pillar is more about our character, our values, our commitment to trust building with our community. So that's much more about who we are and why we do what we do. So I want to bring that new philosophy into the organization, those 2 co-equal pillars, and set them right on top of that existing foundation. And then finally, like I said, I wanted to kind of emerge from those 6 months, being ready and effective as a leader to lead with a new shared vision. And what that shared vision is, out of that work that I just talked about, is that we're going to be very good at improving public safety or fighting crime, while at the same time building community trust, because we want to do those things at the same time. And also we're going to become more inclusive and reflective of our community. And what that produces for us is we're going to become a model for 21st century policing. And I know we can make that vision a reality. The reality that we're going to make happen is that we are going to become a model for 21st century policing in the state of Oregon and throughout the nation, actually. So I've also got a lot more ideas on where we go from there, but this was just about my first 6 months. So that's what I hope to accomplish during my first 6 months. And also, I think the second question was diving a little deeper into trusting relationships with some of our more disadvantaged community. And I have a lot of experience to draw from that hands-on, firsthand experience from Stockton. And I think I'll just mention one of those is the work we did through the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. We were one of only 6 cities in the nation that were selected to participate in that. And in a sense, we became a petri dish in Stockton for testing out these concepts, these trust-building concepts with our community, especially with minority communities. These concepts of procedural justice and implicit bias and a racial reconciliation framework that led into a complete review and revision of our policies and procedures. So we did that work hands-on. And if you just Google that, National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, and read the Stockton Executive Summary, you'll see that we moved the needle in all dimensions more than any other city. So we were more effective with that than any other city. And it's given me hands-on, practical understanding of how to do that. It's not stuff that I've read in a book or just heard or thought about. It's stuff that I've done firsthand along with Chief Eric Jones. And we've proved that it's effective. So now you have a strategy there that's evidence-based because it's backed up by research. It may not be the answer or the final solution, but it's proven effective. And I want to take that experience with me and bring it into Salem. I want to give that to the community here in Salem. That's one of the reasons why I want to come to Salem.
Thank you for that. The next question is John from Ward 6 asked, and it's related to mental health, mental illness. And there's a number of conditions which could cause a person to look normal, but in stressful situations could escalate into verbal or physical behaviors that are apparently in oppositional defiance to the police. Across the country, similar situations have on occasion ended in officer-involved violence. What can the department do to ensure positive outcomes in these incidences?
I think there's a variety of things that we can and should be doing. I'll touch on a few. First of all, I think it does start with training of your officers. Make sure they're well trained in crisis intervention and de-escalation tactics so they can recognize those signs and symptoms that may not necessarily be an officer safety threat and may be more of an indication of a behavioral health issue. Being able to recognize those and then train for how to de-escalate those situations. And the training that I'm talking about there needs to be good contemporary training where it's scenario-based, right? Not just in the classroom. This needs to be scenario-based training to model real-world situations as much as possible so that officers can actually practice these skills in de-escalating these situations. So we really need to invest in that sort of training and making sure that it's continual, ongoing training within all of our organizations. And I've done some of that work in Stockton, and we'll do that here in Salem, of course, as well. I think there's also other models for just how we respond to those calls that we need to continue to explore. And everybody's heard of in Eugene, the CAHOOTS program, and that is one model that I believe in that's effective. And it may be tailored a little bit differently for different cities and situations, but I do think there's a need to reduce the reliance on law enforcement to respond to those type of calls of crisis situations and include professionals that are trained to handle those situations. But at the same time, balancing the safety of the situation as well. I mean, you wouldn't want a social worker obviously talking to an armed individual. And so there's a way to partner up together and coordinate that response that makes sense so the law enforcement is not the only response. And you know, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so if you're going to take a police officer and put them in a situation, a behavioral health situation, they're just not trained and equipped to handle that necessarily in the right way. So you do want to bring the experts into the situation, but you have to balance that safety need that exists too. So there's a couple things we can do there. I do think we need to explore models like that, and we need to partner, for example, with more of a mobile crisis unit responding, and how we dispatch those calls from the beginning need to be triaged better and routed to the right type of response with the professionals involved.
Thank you. Natasha from Ward 6 asks, this year Salem saw protests that resulted in police using tear gas and such other crowd control measures for the first time in recent history. How do you approach crowd control in large gatherings such as protests, and what standards do you use when determining if and when a police presence and escalated response is necessary?
Yeah, I got a lot to say on this topic. I appreciate the question, and it's such a deep question that we're all facing in law enforcement right now. We see it across the country. And first of all, let's just acknowledge that primarily what this is about, especially if you look at most recently George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis, each time these incidents happen, it just tears open this wound that's never fully healed between law enforcement and specifically our African American community. So this wound just continually gets reopened. And what you're seeing playing out on the streets in many circumstances is just an expression of that frustration and anger that's pent up over generations, actually. So at least we need to recognize that and acknowledge that context that exists. But more specifically about protests, I was fortunate enough as a lieutenant maybe 15 years ago to create the very first crowd control team in my department, right? And this was way before we had any protests going on. So we created our first mobile field force team, and I was the commander. And from day one, I recognized, and our whole team recognized, just how important this team was and how challenging of an environment they may be placed into, because they were going to be asked to stand right on the line between protecting our cherished First Amendment rights, right? Which is what we are sworn to do and will give our lives to do. We want to protect people's freedom of speech, their right to peaceably assemble. On the other side, we have a duty to protect our community and ensure public safety. And so at times, those come into conflict during these protest situations. And so to me, that's part of the dividing line, is having enough finesse and understanding to determine when something has moved from a constitutional right to a public safety challenge that we need to address, or vice versa. And so that is so complex and so challenging and volatile during the situation that you have to place your best people in those situations. Only your best people, which means you're going to have to invest. You can't start preparing for the protest that's going to happen tonight. That's too late. You're going to have to prepare way in advance, and you need to train your team to be the best, equip them to be the best, and then permeate down the philosophy of your approach towards protests in the right way to the line level, so that when they're placed in that volatile situation, they know how to make those right decisions. So that's the investment in the organization and the training and the equipment and the personnel. More importantly, I think, is an investment in your community. So some of the trust building work that I've been talking about is exactly the answer here. Ultimately, the crux of the matter here is a failure or a lack of police legitimacy. It's a trust issue with our community. That's what's happening. And until we get to the heart of fixing the trust issues, this is never going to go away. It's only going to get worse. So as law enforcement leaders, we need to own that. And we need to own that, and we need to dive and step into those situations and do the hard work necessary to invest in those relationships with our community and repair some of the damages there. So it's equal there. It's training, preparing, equipping very well, having the right approach and philosophy, but also investing in your community relationships years in advance before the protests happen. But I think the question too was specifically, what would be my protocol for the response? And I touched on it a little bit there. And again, in Stockton, I've managed many of these protests, and thankfully, we haven't had to deploy gas or less lethal munitions. And I think it has to do with those two things I just talked about. But also, we need to move as a profession from this old model of escalated force, right? Which was a crowd gets ruly, someone throws a rock or a bottle, and then suddenly we treat the whole crowd as an unlawful assembly, and we deploy gas, and we make them all move. That's an escalated force approach. We need to continue to move more into this new model, this contemporary model that's about negotiated management. It's about being much smarter about the way you manage these protests. And if there is an instant where you need to use force, first of all, you don't want to show a heavy presence of force in the first place. You want to have a tiered approach. But if it does come to the point, let's say there's serious vandalism occurring, or there's an assault, that's intolerable, right? We can't have violence occurring on the streets. We need to be very surgical about how we address that and just remove the agitators that are involved as best we can. Again, this is a volatile situation, but our approach should be to be as surgical as possible, remove the folks that are engaged in that criminal behavior, and let the rest of the folks continue to practice their First Amendment rights. That's my philosophy on protests. And you have to train that through the entire organization so that the line level commanders that are in the field know how to make those decisions on the fly.
Very good. Ryan from Ward 5 asks, how do you see the role of police interacting with Salem's homeless population? How can we trust you to serve the population beyond the pass-failed methods of arrest and moving homeless camps?
Yes.
And how can we empower police to work with the homeless population toward long-term solutions?
First of all, I know this, just like up and down the West Coast, this is a major issue for the city of Salem. And matter of fact, your community surveys over the past several years have continually moved it to the top, and now it is the top issue for Salem residents in your community surveys. So I understand that, I recognize that, and I've dealt with similar concerns in my own community. So I know how important this issue is. And unfortunately, what I've seen too is that too often, again, like I said, there's no agency to end homelessness. So too often, the minor criminal behaviors that are sometimes associated with homelessness result in a police call for service, and no one else is there to help. And when we get drawn into situations where we should never be involved in the first place. And so the last thing we want to do is criminalize homelessness. That's the last thing. If someone's deep in addiction or crisis, or they don't have the life skills to get themselves out of that hole and get employment, the last thing they need is a citation or an arrest to just bury them further in the hole. And so we don't want to criminalize homelessness, but at the same time, the police are definitely a key stakeholder that should be at the table. So we're not the solution, but we are part of the solution, and we need to be engaged in that collaborative effort to deal with those deep social ills. And so for me, the answer is to try to find those high-level collaborative strategies that can bring all the right stakeholders together to holistically approach this problem of homelessness. And there's an array of strategies there, but too often it just trickles down to the police. And ultimately, we don't have the skills or the tools or the expertise to handle that social ill that exists. So for me, it's really about, at the executive level, for me, my role is to step outside my role a bit, be willing to step out, outside the box, and engage in what wouldn't be a traditional law enforcement role with other community stakeholders to try to deal with this problem in the right way. And we should never rely on arrest as the solution. So those are my thoughts on homelessness. It's really about collaboration, and it's really about trying to reduce the over-reliance of arrest and incarceration regarding the homelessness. And I know this issue too was discussed at a recent council meeting. There was a special work session on, police responses to non-criminal offenses. And so this is an issue that's being talked about at the policy level. And things like the CAHOOTS model that we talked about, the LEAD program in Stockton, we started a LEAD initiative like you have here as well. I know there's Marion County LEAD, which is a law enforcement assisted diversion, where you actually have your police officers trying to divert the chronic homelessness away from the criminal justice system through building relationships and not enforcing low-level crimes, but actually using those as leverage to get people engaged in the services they need. So that's where we need to go as a profession when it comes to homelessness.
Thank you. And that takes us to the end of our time today. So what would you like to leave the Salem community with in closing?
First of all, I just want to express a profound sense of gratitude for even, becoming a finalist. I've really appreciated the process. It's been fun for me personally. This is a career goal that I've had that just hasn't played out for me in my current city, and Salem is the only place where I want to go to do it. And so I want to be thankful to the community, and for those that submitted questions, especially for participating. I highly value that, and thankful to the city directors and the council for this process and the city manager. But I want to emphasize here that if I'm given this opportunity, that I'm all in, because I don't do anything halfway. So you'll have all of me, and I'll be here as long as I'm needed and I produce value for the city and the organization and the community. So whether that means I'm here for 3 years or 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, I'm here as long as it takes to get the job done, and I'm committed to the city of Salem. I'm not applying for any chief's jobs anywhere else. This is not some sort of stepping stone to bigger and better things for me. This is sincerely about me wanting to take my set of experiences over the past 29 years, attain that career goal that I've always wanted, but bring it into Salem and just give back to the profession, give to the community, give to the department, give to the elected officials, and serve and finish out my last years of my career right here in Salem. So I'm all in on this if I'm given the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you. And that takes us to the end of our public forum today. And for those watching still, you can see that the city manager has 2 outstanding candidates from which to choose. And we're glad to have had this opportunity to share their experiences with the Salem community.